NATO and its allies placed crushing sanctions on Russia. Then they stood back and watched, waiting for the Russian economy to collapse. But this is not what happened. Russia's economy is in decline and there are shortages of certain goods, but overall, Putin's nation is weathering the storm. In fact, the IMF had to revise its economic forecast for Russia from a prediction of decline to one of growth. How is it possible that the Russian economy is still strong 1 year into the war? And what does it mean for Ukraine? Just before we get started, let's be clear. Because Russia's economy might be predicted to grow does not mean everyone in Russia is thriving. We live in a global economy, which means that many factors will influence a nation's economic forecast. There's no doubt that the war in Ukraine has taken a toll on Russian businesses and people. Even if certain industries bring in large sums of money and the government claims profits, does not necessarily mean that every aspect of the economy is doing well. When Russia invaded Ukraine, the nation had a very large reserve of money to ensure it could fund the war effort. The Kremlin already knew that sanctions would be enacted on them, but they really didn't care, as the war was supposed to be over in a matter of weeks. However, 1 year later, the battle in Ukraine continues to rage on. Russia's finding itself losing this war, and with every day it continues, Russian reserves are becoming depleted. So what does the Russian economy look like a year after the war began, and what's going to happen in the year to come? The United States and its allies firmly believe their sanctions would cause Russia a lot of economic pain, but this doesn't seem to be the case, at least not at the rate that the West had hoped for. In May of 2022, most analysts predicted that Russia's GDP would fall around 7 to 8%. Some even believed the sanctions would result in a 15% reduction in Russia's GDP. Now that 2023 has begun, it appears the Russian GDP will only decline by about 3.3%, which is significantly less than expected. Inflation also seems to have leveled off, lower than anticipated around 12%, while the Russian population's real income declined by about 2 to 2.5%. It's also important to note that there was still a decline, and although the sanctions did not have a short-term effect that the West had hoped for, the long-term effects will likely be devastating for the Russian economy if the sanctions are not lifted. The most shocking thing about the Russian economy was the revised prediction that the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, came out with recently. They predicted in October of 2022 the Russian economy would decline by about 2.3% in 2023. However, the revised assessment has the Russian economy growing in the coming year. Though the war has cost the Kremlin billions of dollars and the loss of hundreds of thousands of Russian citizens, the economy is still expected to grow by around 0.3%. This statistic seems even crazier when compared to Europe's largest economic hubs, Germany and Britain. The German economy is forecasted to only grow by 0.1% in 2023, while the British economy is predicted to decrease by 0.6%. Even with all the sanctions placed on Russia, the fact it's fighting a losing war, the economy appears to be holding firm, although looks can be deceiving. Part of the positive outlook for Russia has to do with an overall revision of the global economic forecast. The IMF now believes that the global economy will grow by 2.9%, which is slightly higher than initial predictions. An overall increase in global growth might actually help Russia more than the sanctions will hurt it. That being said, the IMF did warn that the war in Ukraine is a major vulnerability in the global economy, and if things escalate, it could throw economies across the planet into turmoil. Let's now take a look at the different sectors of the Russian economy and see how they've fared since the start of the war. We'll start with the key industries that have allowed Russia to survive the onslaught of economic sanctions imposed on it by the West. Unsurprisingly, arms manufacturing was one of the main components that kept the Russian economy from going into immediate recession. As the war ramped up, so did the production of weapons and ammunition. Normally, arms manufacturing only makes up around 1 to 2% of the industrial output of Russia. However, since the invasion began, this sector has increased to around 5% of total production. As Ukrainian forces continue to destroy and capture Russian equipment, arms manufacturers need to make sure Russia doesn't run out of weapons, tanks, missiles, and artillery shells. The Russian economy has shifted from one that operates in relative peace to a wartime economy, meaning that the manufacturing sector has large amounts of money coming in from the government and private investors. Besides arms manufacturing, Russia's natural resources are also helping the nation weather the sanctions storm. Russia has a lot of natural gas and oil. What this means is that even though a number of agreements to reduce buying resources from Russia have been implemented, certain nations still rely on the warmongering nation for its energy supplies. A lot of European countries have done a good job of reducing their reliance on Russian fossil fuels, but other parts of the world have been picking up their slack. Over the last year, Russian fossil fuels have brought in more than $165 billion in revenue. This is 30% more than in 2021. This might surprise you, since there was less conflict and fewer sanctions in 2021 before Russia invaded Ukraine. So how could revenue from oil and gas increase by so much throughout the war? Fossil fuels make up around 45% of the overall revenue for Russia and around 60% of its export revenues. These numbers are huge, which explains why Russia exporting around 7.5% more oil and gas in 2022 has helped the economy remain relatively stable. After the war got going and it was clear Ukraine was going to put up a fight and draw out the conflict, European countries decided to stop importing oil from Russia. Obviously, they couldn't just completely cut off the purchase of oil, as this would cause prices to skyrocket and could devastate European households. However, over time, Europe decreased its dependence on Russian oil. The world expected this would hurt the Russian economy, but that's not what happened. India, China, and Turkey ramped up their oil purchases and made up for almost all of the oil that would have been bought by Europe. These countries receive Russian oil at a discount, which means that Russia did not make as much money as they would have by selling it to Europe, but it was enough to keep the economy going and fuel the Russian war machine. Natural gas has also played a role in funding the war in Ukraine and keeping the Russian economy from entirely collapsing. Russia continued to sell natural gas to countries in Asia and along its border, but when Putin cut off gas supplies to Europe in an attempt to freeze the Western countries, it didn't go as planned. Europe was able to tap into its own gas reserves, and since the winter was relatively mild toward the end of 2022 and into 2023, they only needed to use around 12.5% of their own supplies. This is about 5% less than they used the year before. The inability to sell gas to Europe caused overall sales to fall by around 45%. This was bad news for Russia, as it hurt one of their main revenue streams and didn't really have much effect on Europe. However, other parts of the world continued to purchase gas from Russia. This, combined with strong oil sales, is part of the reason why the Russian economy did not collapse in the way that many predicted it would during the first year of the war. But an economy is more than just a country's main exports. A number of other sectors are suffering greatly after the first year of the war in Ukraine. It's important to remember that Russia had a large amount of reserves in its coffers for this very occasion. The Kremlin has used this money as a cushion to slow the nation's economic decline. While we look at the overall health of the Russian economy, however, things don't look great. Average Russian citizens are the ones being hurt most by the war and resulting sanctions. This has led to some pretty important economic sectors suffering greatly as well. Many private companies are reducing their investments in the country. They're also firing workers to help cope with inflation and the slowing of Russia's economy. Entire cities are dialing back spending and investments at the expense of infrastructure improvements. For example, the city of St. Petersburg has reduced its spending on a new subway system by 25 billion rubles, which was supposed to help people commute to work and get around the city. Foreign companies are also pulling investments from Russia. One of the industries that has been hit especially hard in Russia is car manufacturers. Leaders in the industry have shut down entire factories and let go of their Russian employees. Russian car companies can no longer get the parts they need from Western suppliers, and the parts that are secured tend to be scooped up by military contracts to build more war vehicles. This means that the auto sales have decreased by around 60% since the invasion. Sometimes hard to remember that the people of Russia have all the same needs as citizens of other countries. Russian citizens and businesses in the country often get lost in the noise created by their insane president and the war he's waging. Russians go shopping, they commute to work, they have families, yet sometimes we lump the Russian population into the category of the enemy, even though the vast majority of people there are just trying to get by. This is what makes examining the economy of a nation somewhat heartbreaking. Vladimir Putin doesn't care if his people are suffering as long as he has the money and manpower to fuel his war in Ukraine. Just like the United States or any other part of the world, goods bought by the populace in Russia contribute largely to the health of the economy. It's increasingly clear that the internal aspects of the Russian economy are struggling to stay afloat as the war reaches its one-year anniversary. Real estate in the country has fallen off a cliff. In Moscow, prices have been slashed by up to 30% just to move inventory. The resistance or inability of the Russian people to spend money on new properties will greatly hurt the economy in the future. Russia has spent the past several years investing in large-scale construction projects to create new housing and office spaces around the country. Without buyers, these structures will remain empty, which could lead to the collapse of the real estate market. And if this wasn't enough to rock economic sectors across the nation, the Russian central bank implemented harsh measures to ensure that inflation was kept under control. As the war really got going and it was clear Russia wouldn't win the war in the first few weeks or even months of the war, the Russian central bank sharply increased interest rates to keep the ruble from falling in price. It had the desired effect, as there was a 36% reduction in loans given by banks, which is one of the ways to slow inflation. However, the central bank then did something eerily similar to what U.S. banks did in the housing market crash back in 2008. Throughout the war, the Russian central bank increased the number of mortgage loans they gave out to people who could only afford to place a small down payment of 10 to 20% on a property. This meant that in 2022, while the war was happening, Russian citizens were receiving mortgage loans at incredibly high interest rates, and the fact that they could only place a small down payment on a property should have indicated that these people probably didn't have the necessary income to ensure they can make all of their payments on time, especially in a time of war and economic uncertainty. So now the Russian central bank might have a number of outstanding loan payments to collect on that people just can't afford. This could eventually lead to a huge number of people completely defaulting on their loans and the collapse of the housing market. Sound familiar? About halfway through the first year of this war, this is exactly what happened. Around 13% of borrowers began defaulting on their high-interest loans, non-payment on car loans increased by 19% in September 2022 alone, and unpaid mortgage loans rose by 35%. As we reach the end of the first year of the war in Ukraine, the Russian economy is paying for the bad loans given out by banks. Overall, banks have been giving out fewer loans since the war started to help curb inflation. However, the loans they have been giving out are high risk, and the fact that with each month the war continues, more and more people will be defaulting on their payments is a very bad sign for the Russian economy. Again, we need to remember that Russia isn't just a nation of soldiers and crazy oligarchs who want to invade their neighbors. They're regular people who just do regular people things like go to school, eat out, and see movies. Every sector has been hit hard by the war. But as the fighting continues and the Russian people look for some kind of escape to normalcy, they find activities they once enjoyed are in short supply. Although entertainment and leisure aren't the largest sectors of the Russian financial market, they do play a role in the overall health of the economy. It's estimated that restaurants in Russia have had their revenues cut in half since the war began. People no longer have the money to spend on the things they once enjoyed, as jobs are lost and the prices of goods continue to climb. However, there is a bigger problem, especially for industries that require a large number of workers to operate. As more and more Russian citizens are conscripted to the military to fight the war, a labor market shortage has sprung up. On top of losing employees to the war effort, more than 700,000 people have fled Russia to try to escape being conscripted or to get away from the oppressive rule of the Kremlin. What this means is that the workers, one of the key components of a healthy economy, are in extremely short supply. Experienced staff is becoming harder and harder to find, as the people who make up this demographic are the same people being sent to fight in the war. Russian teachers have reported they have fled to places like Kazakhstan, Armenia, and Georgia, where they're now teaching classes in those countries. Russian restaurateurs are opening new locations outside of their native country where there are more opportunities. If the war lasts much longer, there will be no one left to work jobs outside of wartime production in Russia. And for obvious reasons, a single industry nation that relies on war to fuel its economy is a very dangerous thing. The government claims it'll never conscript more than 30% of a business's employees. However, this seems to be an empty promise. Putin is scared. He needs more men to throw at Ukrainian forces, and he doesn't care where they come from. Young men who once worked normal 9-to-5 jobs are quickly finding themselves on the front lines with minimal training and no combat experience. Which begs the question, when the war ends, will there be any workers left to rebuild the damage Putin and his war machine has done to the Russian economy? After analyzing how badly the first year of the war is going for Russia, it does not seem likely. It is slightly ironic that the Kremlin is hurting the Russian economy in ways that the West could only dream of doing. NATO and their allies enacted harsh sanctions on Russia that had relatively little effect. However, the Russian government, conscripting hundreds of thousands of men, giving out bad loans, and spending most of their reserves on the war, is setting the foundation for the economic collapse that the West had hoped for. One of the most important sectors for Russia is information technology. In a world where computer programmers, hackers, and tech gurus rule, Russia cannot afford to lose key talent in the sector. However, it's now finding itself in an IT crisis that could have drastic consequences for its economy. Since the war began, it's estimated that around 30% of Russia's IT labor force has left the country. Businesses around the world are looking for IT workers, and the nations along Russia's borders are happy to scoop up skilled workers regardless of where they came from. Some Russian companies are even taking huge risks to retain IT talent. Stories have been coming out of businesses being subpoenaed by the government to hand over employees to fight in the war, but instead of complying, they transfer their workers to a location outside of the country. So rather than losing experienced workers, some Russian businesses are taking the risk of lying to the Kremlin, relocating their workers and hoping they don't get caught. It's clear that companies are taking drastic measures to keep themselves going even though the health of the Russian economy is declining. Again, the economy is not just measured by the amount of wartime equipment that can be manufactured or the quantity of natural resources that are sold. It also includes the prices of goods, the income level of citizens, and the ability of businesses to operate efficiently. At the start of the conflict, the Russian military seemed powerful enough to crush Ukraine, at least on paper. However, as we have seen, sheer numbers can be deceiving. The same is true of the Russian economy. Over the last year, the Russian economy has looked good on paper. There have been profits in key sectors and successful measures taken to slow the economic decline of the nation while keeping inflation under control. But the Russian economy is not healthy. The first year of the war is going to have long-lasting consequences, and Russia's economy is teetering on the edge of a recession. The illusion of a healthy economy is not the same as having a healthy economy. Russia still has nations willing to buy its natural resources, and since they have a lot of them, this will bring in huge amounts of revenue. However, as the first year of the war ends, Russia is finding that profits from almost every other sector besides oil and gas have declined. The Russian government can only raise taxes so high, cut spending on non-war related projects so low, and incur so much debt before the economy implodes on itself. This brings us to what might be the final nail in the economic coffin for Russia. As the war continues to drag on, it's the Russian people who are suffering. Putin, his entourage, and the rich are able to sustain themselves during tough times. In fact, you wouldn't even know that there's a war going on when looking at the lavish dinners served at the Kremlin or the way Russian businessmen are spending their money. However, 143 million ordinary people living in the country are definitely feeling the war's impacts on the economy. With each day that passes after the one-year anniversary of Putin's invasion of Ukraine, the Russian people are losing more and more faith in him. The citizens of Russia can only endure so much pain and suffering. And since people are the backbone of the economy, when they've had enough, it could cause things to spiral out of control quickly. This is why, when the IMF revised its economic forecast for Russia, it included an addendum that basically said, if everything stays the same, the Russian GDP might increase slightly. If everything goes to hell in a handbasket because of the war, the Russian economy will freefall into oblivion. This is paraphrasing, of course, but you get the idea. While the Russian central bank seems to have curbed inflation over the last year, this is not the full picture. Due to higher taxes, a decrease in product demand, and the unpredictability of the future, the income of Russian citizens has not kept up with rising prices. This means that although the ruble might have remained at somewhat stable levels, Russian citizens are not able to afford some basic necessities, let alone purchase goods that would help fuel the economy. One major contributing factor that kept Russia's economy semi-solvent during the first year of the war was the high prices of oil and gas. Russia had resources that everyone wanted, and the war, along with several other global economic concerns, drove oil prices way up. Russia was able to profit off of this scramble to purchase oil and gas, but as the second year of the war begins, this no longer seems to be the case. The economies of the United States and Europe are slowing down. Some argue that recessions have already started, meaning spending is being cut across the board. Oil and gas prices have been in a steady decline, which suggests that Russia will not be able to make the same huge profits on fossil fuels as they did last year. This also is true because of the sanctions and price ceilings Western nations have enacted on Russian goods. What all of this means is that oil and gas companies in Russia will bring in less revenue in the coming year. And when this happens, the Russian government will receive less in taxes, and Putin will have less cash to fund his war. This is all on top of the fact that people in Russia can't pay back their loans. There's a mass exodus of workers trying to escape conscription, and inflation is starting to hit the general population hard. When we look at all the economic data collected over the past year, as Russia continues to wage the war in Ukraine, a very grim picture of Russia's economic future is painted. Putin's war is not sustainable. Much of the world has turned its back on Russia, and if Putin decides to continue sending his citizens to die in Ukraine to fuel his delusions of grandeur, it might cause a tipping point in Russia itself. Even if the general populace doesn't rebel, there's only so much people can take before there's some sort of forced change. All indications suggest that Ukraine will continue to be successful at pushing Russian forces out of their country. It's also clear that Vladimir Putin will not admit defeat, which suggests he will conscript even more men to fight in his war. Uncertainty about the future is what might be keeping the Russian economy afloat at the moment. As soon as something goes wrong for Russian forces in Ukraine, or the war is completely lost, it's highly likely the Russian economy will collapse as the nation reorganizes itself into a post-war structure. It's anyone's guess what this will actually look like, but a recession is almost inevitable for the Russian economy at this point. The question becomes, when will it happen? As the second year of the war in Ukraine is about to begin, Putin will continue to pour money into his military while creating more pain for Russian businesses and people. Eventually, all of his wartime spending will catch up with the Russian government, and with the current weak foundations in several sectors, the entire Russian economy could come crumbling to the ground. Now watch the one change to Russia Putin couldn't predict: war in Ukraine. Or check out experts reveal why Russia is in trouble.